We turn now to 1 Peter and chapter 3 and verse 7. Last week we were considering the attitude of the godly wife to her husband. In verse 7, Peter speaks about the attitude that the godly Christian husband should have towards his wife. You husbands likewise. Again, the likewise is exactly like the phrase in the first verse, in the same way. And that refers back to the 5 verses with which chapter 2 concludes. Chapter 2, verses 21 to 25. You husbands likewise. That means, just like the example of Christ given in chapter 2, verse 21 to 25, we are to follow the same example as husbands. Live with your wives in an understanding way. It's possible for a husband to go on in life without giving any consideration for the feelings of his wife, or perhaps without any understanding of the feelings of a woman, which are different from his feelings as a man. And then, of course, he's seeking to go through life without denying himself. And then, of course, he's not following the example of Christ, who never pleased himself but denied himself consistently all through his life. And husbands are given that example to follow. Deny yourself, submit yourself. And the way in which a husband can follow the example of Christ is by seeking to understand his wife. Seek to understand the feelings of your wife. Seek to understand the reason why she behaves in that particular way at particular times. It says here that the woman is the weaker vessel. She is weaker physically, first of all, and in other ways too. She cannot bear as many burdens as the man, perhaps, and emotionally she is weaker. She can easily weep and cry, unlike the man who is stronger. But it says here that if you are a godly Christian husband, you will recognize that fact, that she is a weaker vessel. And the mark of spiritual maturity and strength is this, that you can bear with the weaknesses of those who are weaker. We read in Romans 15, in verse 1, that those of us who are strong ought to bear the weaknesses of those who are without strength. Otherwise, we just please ourselves. Christ, it says in verse 3 there, never pleased himself. He denied himself. And a husband must follow the example of Christ and never please himself in relation to his wife. He must deny himself and therefore bear with the weaknesses of the weaker vessel. And a husband is called upon to bear with the weakness of his wife much more than a wife is called to bear the weaknesses of her husband, because it is the wife who is the weaker vessel. And the husband, being the stronger, must bear with the weaknesses of the weaker vessel. And so husbands, likewise, like Christ has borne with our weaknesses, live with your wives in an understanding way. The mark of a godly Christian husband, one mark anyway, would be that he seeks to understand his wife, takes time to talk to her, to listen to her, is not so busy with his work and his own activity, even if it is Christian activity, that he has no time for his wife, but seeks to understand his wife by taking time to listen to what she has to say. Almost the number one complaint of all wives, Christian and non-Christian, would be that my husband has no time to talk to me or to listen to me. That's very important for us to bear in mind. To live in an understanding way with our wives means that we take time to talk with her and to listen to her, not just to talk and to exhort her, but to listen. Thus, we understand what she is going through, the pressures that she's facing. Because she's a weaker vessel, she may have pressures which you don't consider to be a pressure at all. It doesn't mean you're more spiritual. It just means that you're a man and therefore can bear more. Therefore you need to bear with her because she is a woman. That's all. It's got nothing to do with spirituality. She's weaker because she's a woman. And grant her honor, it says here in verse 7, as a fellow heir of the grace of life. Now this means that the husband has to honor the wife. In the previous verse, we read about Sarah obeying her husband Abraham and honoring him by calling him the head of the house, Lord and Master. But it says here, this doesn't mean that the husband doesn't have to honor his wife. The husband has to honor his wife too. Be thoughtful and give her the respect that is her due. The wife is entitled to be respected by her husband. And so it says, grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. The life that you enjoy together is God's gift to you. It's a gracious gift of God to you. It's part of God's grace coming upon you. But it says in that verse that you can receive it only as you live together in an understanding way with your wife, because she is a fellow heir. It's like a property that is to be divided between two people. And you can't have it unless you're willing to share it with the other person. Otherwise you get nothing. In the same way, this grace of life that comes down from God upon a husband and wife cannot come upon the husband unless he's willing to share it with his wife and recognize that she is equally an heir to this grace that comes from God. And therefore, I need to honor her because she is equally an heir with me of that grace that can come from God. Even though in the home God has ordained that the wife should submit to the husband, it doesn't mean that she has no place. If the husband is to be the king, the way to be the king is treat your wife like a queen, and then you can be the king. That's what it means to be a fellow heir. If you are the king, then obviously she is the queen. But if you don't treat her like a queen, then you are not a king either. If you treat her like an animal, then you, being her husband, are an animal too. But treat her like one who is an heir to the throne, to receive grace, the grace of life from God, and then you can be a king. And then it says in the last part of that verse, that if you do this, God will listen to your prayers. Otherwise, your prayers will not get answered. And here is the reason why the prayers of many husbands are not answered. Because they do not live with their wives in an understanding way. They do not consider that she is a weaker vessel and don't bear with her. They do not grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, and so their prayers are hindered. We read in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 18 and verse 19 that if two of you agree about anything that they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. If two people can agree, and agree there means to symphonize together. That's the Greek word from which that word agree comes. It's a musical orchestra where everybody's playing the correct note on the correct scale, on the same scale. And there we see a husband and wife being one. If they are one like this in their life, anything they ask for can be answered by the Father. But when we are not one, then the devil gets an advantage over us and our prayers are not answered. Then our children are affected and our home is affected. Think of the tremendous power that there will be in your home, dear friend, if you and your wife are one. If you can obey the exhortation given to a husband in verse 7, it will mean that you and your wife can be one, and your prayers will have tremendous power, and God will be able to mightily bless your home.